Welcome back to another episode of the Wet Dreamz Podcast. I'm your host, Jose Gonzalez. I'm a mental health counselor and a sex therapist.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brad Hinman. I am also a licensed mental health counselor. I'm a sex therapist and a marriage and family therapist.
Yeah, today we're going to be continuing our series on treating out of control sexual behavior / problematic sexual behavior. So this kind of series is both for people that are seeing individuals, like other therapists or providers that are seeing individuals with maybe this issue, problematic sexual behavior, but mainly it's for our guys, the people that we see, to have kind of a structure of what some steps they can follow to hopefully get better from this issue. It's a plaguing issue. The numbers going up, I feel like. And by the way, we're not like demonizing pornography or like whatever, but we do see guys from all spectrums of everywhere having issues with porn, sex addiction, online sexual behavior, all of that kind of stuff, and having real issues, and their relationships are getting ruined and all that stuff. So so today is the second part of our little motto, and by the way, motto will be available in the show notes. We have a little model we've created and some worksheets that we have on there, so you can follow along and stuff like that. Working on a book eventually, knock on wood. But this is episode 2. The first part, we talked about the initial kind of creating distance from the behavior. You're putting in place like accountability, and you're like, setting up a structure so you can have some distance from this behavior. You're starting to think about coping skills. What are some other things I can do instead of using porn or sex or any of those other sexual behaviors? And then, so today we're talking about sexual history. This is like kind of the foundation, I feel like, of where when our treatment comes into play, of like the way we put it is like we want to catch up to the 30 years, 40 years, whatever, however old the person is, to catch up to the 30 years of sexual history, and play catch up, because we weren't with them their whole lives, of course. But this is where we're getting a bunch of that information, right? How do you typically present that to your clients early on or whatever?
Just like that, I say, you've been running this race for decades, and I just met you, and so I need to know what you know, right? And a sexual history, for those of you that are not familiar with that term, so it's basically anything sexual that you've done in your life, so including porn, masturbation, sex with a partner, like sexual abuse is included in there too. So it's like when, how often, who with, toys, sexual problems, that have developed over time as well. Sexually transmitted infections, all that stuff is included in that.
Anything sex related.
Mm-hmm.
And another way I think I often put it too is like, as you write down these experiences, or as you look at all these things that's happened or whatever, you can't help but see themes or see some things that happen. Like when something bad happens in my life, I've noticed that my pornography use or those sexual behaviors have increased. You know what I mean? So that's like an important theme to know. So that's like another reason I think that we do it. There's both the catching up thing, but also for the guy to like see themes.
Mm-hmm. And for us, so the guy to see themes, but for us to see themes as well. Because sometimes people, like, it's your life, and so it's hard to make connections between events, right? So, like, sometimes people will say, well, our marriage got really bad like 3 years ago. Well, what was happening 3 years ago? Well, I don't know. And then they list like 5 major stressors in their life, but they didn't put those together that they had anything to do with their marital problems. So, so it helps us to see themes as well, and know kind of where. So another way I conceptualize it to clients is I need to know where to jump in this stream, right? Like I need to know like where to jump in to best help save you, right? Like, or make adjustments to your life. So
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and it's so funny how that's separate in people's minds. Like this bad thing happened, or this was my use was the most, but somehow it's separate from actually what's happening in life or something. Like it happens a lot where it's you start listing off and like, oh a loved one died, or like my parents got divorced, and like there's like 3 or 4 things, and they don't even realize.
Right.
Like, well, that definitely had an an effect on your behaviors, your healthy coping or unhealthy coping skills,
Yep.
Yeah. So one of the first things we ask in the sexual history, what's your first sexual memory? I like how you put it with people a lot of times. How do you usually put like that initial part?
Yeah. Tell me about your first sexual experience.
Yeah, that's right.
And so the reason I ask that is because and it's become that question over years, right? Because I used to say, tell me about the first time you had sex. But you would think that that's a pretty straightforward question, but it's not. Because is oral sex, or are we just talking about penile vagina penetration? What about penis anal penetration? Is that sex, right? And so people interpret things differently. And so I've just kind of morphed over time into tell me about your first sexual experience. Another benefit of asking it that way is because people have talked to me about times that they've been sexually abused, but they didn't conceptualize that as sexual abuse. They classified that as a sexual experience. And so, they were 12 and their babysitter was 24, and they're thinking that that's a sexual experience. And in my mind, I'm like, that is clearly sexual abuse. But if I would have said to that person, have you ever been sexually abused? He would have said no, because in his mind, it wasn't abuse.
Yeah.
That's the day he lost his virginity or whatever.
Right.
And so you can gather much more information, in my opinion, of me asking it that way than asking more specific questions that can be sidestepped easily. Right. And so, that's the way I usually start, is tell me about your first sexual experience. And so if they were 6 or 8 or whatever, then that's where I jump into the stream, right? So
exactly.
And so then we just move forward from there.
Yeah, and that's also another common thing too, that part of like, they had a sexual abuse when they were younger, but still considering that a sexual experience. And I don't know, maybe that's probably like the messages that males get, I guess, of like, you should be thankful that an older woman, an older girl, like wanted to be sexual with you. Like, oh, cool, that's like awesome. You know what I mean? Or like having sex with your teacher when you're in high school. Like, oh yeah, everyone fantasizes about that, but it's sexual abuse. Period. You were a child,
And it's not necessarily my job to force them to realize that they were sexually abused. But I know in my mind that is the definition of sexual abuse.
Right.
Because it's difficult for men to, I think it's difficult for anybody, definitely difficult for men to admit that they're a victim, or that they were, because then that means in their minds, which is not true, but in their minds, it means that they're weak or something's wrong with them because they were a victim. And so that could definitely be processed, but it's not my job to force you to admit that. But it is important for our knowledge to know that happened. And then that people often, when they suffer abuse or some sort of trauma, so one way of coping with that is you keep reenacting that trauma, hoping to fix it, right? So then you develop a sexual addiction because you're trying to control that first time that you were sexually abused. I did want to say too that, because you said like when they write down their sexual history, and we often do assign them homework to write their sexual history out. But I've had several clients say that they can't, like they've tried to do that and they can't bring themselves to do it. And so they've specifically asked me to ask them the questions from sexual history verbally in session, which then means I have to write down their sexual history
Right.
because I'm asking them questions and taking
Uh-huh.
notes on their answers. But that's too like overwhelming for them to write it down. And so they get what we call flooded.
Yes.
And then they can't function. So but doing it orally somehow is better for them. Which, like, personally, I don't understand that, because I would much rather write down traumatic stuff than speak it out loud.
Here you go. Hand it off.
Right.
Do what you want with it.
Just anonymously write it down when I'm all by myself and then hand it to somebody. We never have to talk about it again. But I've been asked to like do that orally with somebody, which is a huge honor to me to be asked to do that. But that would be way more intimidating to me, but I'm not them. So
yeah, it feels better for them. And that's a good point too. And I probably will say that more often, but to my clients, but it's a good point to point out, like, why in this step of recovery or whatever the journey, like it's important to take your time as you're writing this sexual history, or like taking breaks, or as a clinician or something listening to this, like taking time, like going at a slower pace, because you just never know what is gonna trigger people, or this is probably one of the first times that this individual, at least in our experience, has had to write a comprehensive, like, age 10, age 12, whatever, of like all the experiences they've had, and just a lot, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
So
it
it's
is
important to take it at a slow pace.
Yep. And I've told clients, like, work on it 10-15 minutes a day. You know, don't, because it can be overwhelming. It's because you're seeing it all together, like all the evidence, so to speak, right? Like all the historical occurrences in a row, and that can be pretty overwhelming.
And potentially most likely triggering the shame response of like, whoa, this is all the stuff I've done. And this is all, I remember that time, like, damn, that was like shitty. Or I was really crazy then, whatever, you know what I mean? I think that could definitely trigger that shame response, because the guys that come in have a lot of shame, you know?
Yep. Yep. And I talk to them too, like, I talk to them about this when we're talking about sexual history, but also I use this in other examples, not sexual history, but I tell them, when you start feeling shame, turn that into motivation to do something different, right? To take control of the situation, or to use that as a power to change the future, rather than, because shame is past based, right? And so if you're feeling shame, your focus is on the past. I want you to change that into the focusing on the future, because the future is where change can happen and where healing can occur. Change and healing is not going to happen in the past, because that's already happened. We can't go back and change anything. And so, like, I try to get people to kind of give them a forethought to when they start feeling shame, to alter that into motivation to change the future.
Awesome. I like that. Definitely. Yeah. So you know, that going back to the initial sexual experiences, it's just gonna look different. Obviously, the journeys are looking different if, you know, your first sexual experience was sexual abuse, versus if the first sexual experience was with porn, versus if the first sexual experience was, you know, going to a sex worker. I've had a client that was their first sexual experience, like, as a rite of passage, you know, or with a girlfriend that you really, you know what I mean? So it's like, I think it gives us a glimpse into, like, okay, well, this is the flavor of this person's, like, issues or whatever.
Yep.
So then we tend to ask about, you know, you want to know about intimate relationships, like past relationships they've been in. What's the nature of that relationship? How's your sexual experiences in that relationship? You know, whether they had sexual issues. You know, I've had clients where they've had sexual issues with one relationship but not with the other. You know, what's going on at that time that's maybe contributing to that. Potentially your pornography use was higher, the problematic sexual behaviors were higher in that time, and that maybe contributed to erectile dysfunction. So it's like all that kind of stuff comes into play. I feel like, you know, it's the details.
Yeah, for sure. And then that's where the patterns start to emerge, right? Like, you can Oh, you had sexual functioning issues with this person, but not with this other person. I wonder why, right? And so, like, what was happening? And of course, the answer is emotions, right? Like, it's tied to their, like, how they were feeling. Are you feeling respected and validated and affirmed and all those things? And so, because I mean, I've had clients talk about, you know, I felt like we were a good match, but sex was not as satisfactory as, you know, but with this other person, sex was great, but we weren't a good match, right? So, so helping to kind of tease out all those nuances, right? Of, well, what makes sex good with this person and sex bad with this other person, and what makes you a good match with one person and not with another person? You know, which kind of leads us to, like, what are you hoping for? What do you want? What are you looking for in a relationship?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that seems to be common as well, or whatever. I've heard that before of, like, you know, maybe guys have been in the thick of their use, if you will, and I'm using like kind of addiction terminology. That's a whole other podcast, but in the, you know, at the height of their use, they had a fulfilling sexual experience that was actually a toxic relationship, but because the partner was open to everything sexually, you know what I mean, like that, they like gave into, I don't know, it's a weird way to say it, but they gave into their addiction and had like a really, like, I don't know, their fuckboy season, if you will. You know what I mean? I feel like I've heard that there's often a time and period in guys' lives where they're like really down into what they're doing. You know what I mean? It's just interesting.
It is, yeah. There's, like, I've seen that too. I'm struggling with the word pattern, right? Like, but there's definitely high points, which are really low points, right? Like,
right.
So like high point of, like, their use is way up here, and then there's times where their use is lower, and so of course we want to know what made your use higher here and what made your use lower here. I mean, I've had clients that, you know, they've gone a year without using, but then they go right back to using at the level they were before. And so, you know, what happened that you were able to be clean and sober, if we continue to use addiction terminology, right? Like, what made you, what happened that you allowed yourself to be clean and sober for like a year? And then what happened that made you return to using, right? And then there's times even while they're using where their use goes up and down, fluctuates, right? You know, sometimes they're masturbating and looking at porn 3 times a day, and then sometimes they can go a week or 2 without looking at porn and masturbating. And so there's a lot of nuances to that. There's a lot of, and I think one thing that makes a good therapist is I'm naturally curious, and I want to know, like, well, give me data. Like, I need I need numbers. Yeah. Like, what was happening? What made it more here and less here? And can you do more of the things that made it less?
Yes.
Right? Like,
I got you.
Can we
but I got you.
Can we reproduce that so that you're using less now?
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Right.
So in other words, I guess a more clear way of saying that is, what works, do more of that. What doesn't work, do less of that.
Yes. Right. And that's part of again, this whole the process is like we've kind of labeled it as the progression. You know, how has this addiction, how has this issue progressed throughout the years? You know, when has it been highest, when has it been the lowest? You know, because a guy that's gone a year, like I've had, you know, a guy that, not to discount that, of course, but I've had a guy that has gone a year because they didn't have internet access versus having a different experience, or going 6 months because you were depressed, or, you know what I mean? Like, it's important to kind of distinguish, or get like the flavor behind it. You know what I mean? Like, it's just different scenarios, whether you know, were you intentional, or like, what are, even in that scenario, what are the good things you did, you know, or was it fully just like you didn't have access or whatever? Which, again, not to say I want to discount it, because you still went some time without doing it, but it's gonna be different things you take from that, experience. And even maybe, maybe it's important for that person to have limited access. Maybe that's a really important thing for them, to make sure that they're blocking everything they need to block, because that seemed to be successful. Not that you can't take anything from it, but it just looks different. It's, you're gonna talk about it differently if depending on their progression throughout the years.
Yeah, because I just had a client too tell me that he told me the longest that he'd been without looking at porn and masturbating, and I said, well, what was happening during that time? And he was also without internet access during that time. And so I'm like, well, is that something you should think about?
Mm-hmm.
Like, can you not be without internet access now?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like voluntarily. I mean, we live in a society where that's really hard.
Yes.
It's really difficult to do that, because a lot of people pay their bills online and everything else. Right. So it's hard but a lot of what we do is we're doing hard things with clients. So,
right. And if that's going to help you be successful,
right.
then is it that or losing your relationship or whatever?
Right. Right. And I always talk to clients about like short term, right? So can you be without internet access for a month, right? I'm not talking about for the rest of your life, because I think that that's almost impossible in this society. But can you do it? Can you be without internet for a month to kind of get some recovery under your belt and some progress being made, so that you being clean and sober has like a foothold in your life, so then you can kind of build on that and reintroduce the internet at a slower pace, right? Like, so 15 minutes a day or something like that, right? Like reintroduce it slowly so that you can maintain more control over that. And so, but a lot of the sexual history is just asking questions and looking for patterns and, looking for things that we can reproduce now that worked then.
Right. Yeah. Another example I've heard a couple times is that the example I often think about when people don't have internet is oftentimes it's like a mission trip, or like they're doing, they're working at a remote place for a certain time for a big project or something. I think the thing that I see often too is like within that, sure, there's not the access, but then part of it I think sometimes is like there's some type of purpose, or there's some type of like utility, like, so it's the internet, sure, but they're doing other things too. Yes. You know what I mean? It's not just like they're sitting there without the internet and just like living their regular life necessarily. You know what I mean?
Yeah, like basic training.
Yes.
Like working at summer camp with kids the whole summer. Right. So there is purpose to that. Yes. Right. It's not, you're right. They're not just sitting there staring into space. And so there might, there's probably something therapeutically useful in that you have focus. Like you're less likely to use porn and masturbate when you have focus and purpose.
Yes.
And you're probably being validated and affirmed and all those things.
Especially those like summer camp or whatever. They're like happy to have people to help, or mission trip or whatever. You know what I mean? Like a lot of those places, they're more than happy to have people there. So for affirmation, that's a big one too. Yeah. For sure. Maybe not as much basic training, I suppose.
But you still have a purpose. Still,
there's a purpose.
You're working your butt off. You're getting up at 4 or 5,
community.
3 o'clock in the morning, whatever. Yes, there's a sense of community, camaraderie. But also everything is controlled for you. Like you're certainly not bored.
Right. You're not allowed.
They tell you when to eat and when to go to the bathroom and when to do whatever. Right. Yeah. And so, and everything is timed and so there is a purpose, right? It's built into that. And it's super stressful from what I've heard. But there's also this fear, like, am I going to make it? Am I going to be okay? Right. And so, but you have purpose. The purpose is given to you, I suppose. Right. But maybe not as much affirmation and validation.
Sure.
But I think there is when you finish.
Right. For sure. Sense of accomplishment. I'm sure there's the little accomplishments. Right. The point being, and obviously shout out to our military, but the point being, like, how has this issue progressed throughout the years, and what has contributed to you being successful or not as successful. You know, what are some strategies you use? What did you try in the past to try to get better from this thing? What worked? What didn't work? You know what I mean? Like, the point is, like, get as much information as you can, get it down, and see if you could start, you know, because often it's not, like, at least with my clients, it's not complicated. We talk about that all the time. Like, the strategy or the thing to get better is not necessarily complicated. You probably have done a lot of these things before, you know, maybe just not in the what is it, the order that it's the most successful, but you've done some of these things. You know, you've had some healthy moments, you've had times where you haven't used or you haven't hooked up with people in unhealthy ways or whatever. You know, it's not easy, but it's not complicated. You know what I mean? So you're like, I'm always looking for, okay, what's things you've done or you've brought to the table before, and then let's rearrange it, you know?
What's worked a little bit is I'll ask that question, right? What's worked for you in the past to help control this, even if it just made a little bit of a difference? And again, the idea is do more of that, right? And do less of the things that trigger you and make you want to use, right? And then in between those two is work on your relationship and building, you know, coming closer to your partner, building healthy sexuality. You know, there's a lot that goes into our sexual natures, right? So, so build on the good, make the bad less powerful. Rebuilding your relationships so you have connection and validation and affirmation from your partner.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and another element to our sexual history, again, we'll make this PDF available in the show notes of our little sexual history thing. But another element to it is, like, the two other ones are, like, you know, when did you first encounter this behavior? In our case, typically it's porn, but, you know, other sexual, problematic sexual behaviors. When did you encounter it? And also, what was your level of sex education, basically, surrounding that? Or perhaps, how do your parents react? Or how did people in your life react to that? You know what I mean? I think those are two kind of similar elements, like when you first encountered it, and then how was it dealt with growing up? You know, I think that's a big one.
All of those are really good questions that I use with clients, especially, well, I mean, all of them, but the one that my brain is focused on right now is like, how did your parents deal with that? Or how did you, like, times that you got caught, like, what happened, right? Because there's a big difference between parents saying, you know, I'm not thrilled that you did this behavior, but let's talk about it. Let's navigate this together. There's a big difference between that and what's wrong with you, and you're making Jesus cry, and, you know, like there's a big difference between those two. And unfortunately, the shame is going to make it more likely that behavior is repeated. So if you're making somebody feel stupid and worthless and unsavable, if that's a word, that, like, if you're making them feel that way, you're creating stress chemicals in their brain, and then they're going to do something to offset those stress chemicals, like looking at porn and masturbating, to make themselves feel better. Right. So you're shooting yourself in the foot. So stop doing that.
Right. You're driving your kid to watch porn.
Yes, basically. Exactly. That's exactly what's happening. It's an interesting job that we have to tell people you're looking at porn because your mom freaked out and screamed at you.
Like, wait a minute, that's weird.
Kind of takes all the fun out of looking at porn and masturbating.
Really a mood killer.
Right, exactly. But
it's true.
It's there. Like, I tell my clients, I don't make the rules. I'm just telling you what's happening. Like,
exactly. Right, exactly. I'm not putting that into, you're just, you know, you're just shouting out the patterns. Like,
Yeah.
it's not my patterns.
Like I tell them, I'm just repeating what you're telling me. I'm not making this up as I go along. You're telling me stuff and I'm just repeating it to you.
Yeah.
And then we're noticing patterns, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
so if you have children and you discover them doing something that you don't like sexually, talk to them about
Yes.
it in a calm way.
Yes.
Right. I'm not saying you have to accept it and embrace it and love that they're looking at porn and masturbating, at 10 years old or whatever. But if you freak out, it's going to make it worse. Well, it's likely to make it worse. It's not guaranteed, but
right. Definitely. Yeah. So that's, we covered a bunch of things. Really, you can just, in the absence of using our little like handout, but really you just want to write down any sexual experiences you've had and like your progression or your interaction with that particular behavior, like the times that you masturbated or the times that you had oral sex with someone or the times you were home secretly on the internet talking to people and like anything you can remember, really, like just get it all out. I think that's like the biggest key to this step is like just vomit out all the information, and then you can start to see, okay, that's interesting.
lots of clients, they'll separate it into like 5 to 8, 8 to 10 years old,
right?
They kind of group it. I've had some people do it like on a timeline kind of a thing, and so
Yep.
there's different ways to kind of get all that information out. It sounds really intimidating for us to say like every sexual experience, every every relationship that you've had, every random sexual hookup, that sounds really intimidating. And it probably is really intimidating, but it's necessary for us to have all that kind of scaffolding to figure out where this problem kind of started and how to, best work with it and make it better. But there's ways to make it more palatable, right? Like by doing it in chunks or like limiting the time that you spend on it. Like I said, I've said to some clients, just spend 10 minutes, 15 minutes a day, like, and come back to it. And if you don't have time in a week's time between appointments to get it all done, that's fine. You can work on it next time. We can talk about what you did do, like what you have written down, and then go back the next week and, do some more. And then we'll talk about that again. It's, because we're not interested in like overwhelming people and flooding them and making them shut down. Like that's not therapeutic. Right. And so, but we also need this information. So
Yeah. I mean, and people have done it in, they'll do it in bullet forms or they'll do it in narrative form or whatever, the bullet form may be a little less overwhelming. Just jot it, and leave or like as opposed to journal form, like writing it all like narrative. Yeah, it's just what the comfort of the person is. Yeah. I think it's important though, because again, this is maybe the first time you really sat with everything. And the whole purpose of our purpose, I think, in treating guys, that is like shining a light, so all this stuff is in your brain or in your experience, but you haven't really shined a light and opened up. And also the act of being vulnerable with us, I think that's very therapeutic as well, of like, and we always personalize porn, but porn doesn't want you to be vulnerable, doesn't want you to share these shameful things with anyone. Like it just wants you to be secretive and like do it out by yourself and feel shitty and just continue using. And I think that itself is also an act of like moving towards healthiness, moving towards whatever fidelity and whatever you want to use.
Secrecy and shame makes your addiction stronger, right?
Exactly. For sure.
So we touched on both of those things today. So.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's a pretty simple one, but it's very a lot of information in that one. I mean, that has taken time, and at least people that I've treated, it takes more than one session often, or it can take a while, or like, you go through it the first time and then you continue talking about stuff, and then something else comes up later on, or like
Yeah.
a different experience, or like you look at an experience in a different way later, and you're like, oh, actually, whatever. You know, it's just interesting. I feel like you said it perfectly. The scaffolding, like the sexual history, is really the foundation of like what's happening. Oh, and I was gonna say too, I couldn't think of what I was trying to say earlier, but you know, if you remember our first episode and we talked about coping skills, you know, creating 5 new coping skills and whatever, like go back to that. That's why those are there. If you're like writing your history and it's getting overwhelming, or if you're thinking about some of these experiences, like then refer back to those coping skills that you created in the beginning. You know what I mean? Like, that's important too, for sure. So sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any final words on the sexual history list, or think you're good? Did we miss anything?
What I guess I don't think that we missed anything, but what I would like to say is, like a sexual history, like I'm picturing people listening to this and like, I'm going to write down my sexual history. It probably would be better to have a therapist there to kind of help you through, not writing down your sexual history, but what's going to happen after you do that, right? Important. To help you deal with the feelings of being overwhelmed, and, you know, because I don't want you to, like, at home do your sexual history and then look at it and be like, I'm a piece of shit,
right?
And then not have anybody to talk to about that, right?
Yes.
Like, that's what we're here for, is to listen to your sexual history and then tell you that you're not a piece of shit,
right? Basically,
right? That
yes.
I mean, because it helps that we've listened to hundreds of people's sexual history, and we're not sitting here oh, you're number 97, right?
Definitely top 5 of
right?
my craziest clients,
right? But it can, like, doing that, if you do it on your own, you can likely experience feelings of being overwhelmed and shame, like really, really intense shame. And so it helps to have a therapist to kind of walk you through that, to kind of pick those pieces up and hold you back together.
Yeah. I like that. That's a good thing, you know, like make sure you have someone, therapist preferably, but also your support system, you know, if you are going to try to do this, like make sure you're thinking about what's the after looks like, or after each time you write, what's that look like? Like, I mean, I need to go see my family, or your mom can give you a hug after, like later on, you know, whatever you need to like be safe and to not feel like trash, you know, for sure. Sweet. Yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing this. I mean, obviously feel free to, again, you know, see the PDF that we have of our model and some of the handouts that we're trying to make for this. We really want to help you and help, you know, we know it's an issue that's like intense, you know, and often there's not as much of like structure of like, okay, do this and this. Like, it's out there, you know, but we're throwing our hat in the ring of like how we can help you. So hopefully you find some positive and some help from it. We appreciate you listening and stuff like that. The Wet Dreamz Podcast and any content posted is intended for general information, educational, and entertainment purposes only. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. It is not intended as a substitute for the advice of a physician, professional coach, psychotherapist, or other qualified professional, diagnosis, or treatment. Listeners should not disregard or delay in obtaining a medical advice for any medical or mental health condition they may have, and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.